My name's Carly, I'm 27, and last week my mom threw me a surprise birthday dinner at this retro diner. I walked in expecting the usual, awkward small talk, a few backhanded compliments. What I didn't expect was for my birthday cake to be the punchline. After dinner, the server came out holding a sheet cake. Everyone turned to me, phones out, already smiling like they were in on something. For a second, just 3 seconds, I actually let myself believe my mom had done something kind. Then I saw what was written on the cake. Big pink letters right across the middle. Oops, still a disappointment. Everything froze. It was like even the air didn't know what to do. And then the whole table broke into laughter. My mom clapped like it was the best joke she'd ever heard. My little brother almost choked on his drink. Someone shouted, "Come on, it's just a joke." I just stared at the frosting like those words had been waiting there for years, just waiting for a moment like this. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I slid my chair back, grabbed my bag, and stood up. My mom told me to sit down and take a joke. I didn't even look at her. I turned toward the exit. Then my uncle stepped in front of me, put a hand on my arm, and told me not to make a scene. I leaned in like I was about to say sorry, and whispered just one sentence into his ear. 2 days later, my whole family was spiraling, and it had nothing to do with the cake. If you're into family drama, quiet revenge, and watching things unravel in slow motion, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. Gets good. The diner looked like something out of an old movie. Red vinyl booths, shiny chrome edges, neon letters buzzing above the counter. I walked in carrying that familiar weight in my chest, the kind that shows up anytime my family puts on a show of being thoughtful, and I'm expected to play along. My mom, Sharon, had already claimed a corner booth, sitting like she was the star of the night. She had perfect posture, one hand wrapped around a sweating glass, her eyes scanning me like she was reading a receipt for errors. My dad, Gregory, sat beside her, shoulders hunched, wearing the face of a man who planned to let the evening pass without getting involved. Across from them, my younger brother Dylan leaned back with his phone, recording clips and paying more attention to his screen than to me. Sliding into that booth didn't feel like joining a celebration. It felt like stepping back into a role I thought I'd finally grown out of. Sharon took inventory the second I sat down, my clothes, my hair, the way I nervously picked at the wrapper on my straw. Her comments came light and breezy, but each one landed with a quiet sting. Gregory mostly stayed quiet. Dylan kept lifting his phone anytime someone laughed, aiming it at me like he was waiting to catch something worth posting. The food came on heavy plates and in plastic baskets. The burgers sagged, the fries left grease everywhere, and the milkshakes sweated under the fluorescent lights. The conversation drifted to my job hunt, and how I apparently wasn't moving fast enough toward whatever future they pictured. Sharon name-dropped people my age with real careers and neat life plans, then let the silence between each example say what she didn't have to. No one said the word failure, but it hung there anyway. I glanced at my reflection in the chrome napkin holder. Dark circles under my eyes, a fake little smile that didn't touch them. I didn't look like someone being celebrated, I looked like someone being sized up. I felt that familiar exhaustion weighing on me again, but underneath it, something colder, quieter just waited. Servers passed by, topping off drinks and clearing plates. Sharon got more animated as the table emptied, like she was building to some big finale. She kept glancing toward the counter, and each glance sent a jolt through my chest. Then, when most of the food was gone and the diner had gone quiet, I saw the server nod toward our table and slip behind the kitchen door. Dylan sat up straighter, phone already aimed and recording. Gregory wiped his hands on his jeans like he was bracing for something. I didn't move. I just sat there, feeling this shift in the air that had nothing to do with the lights above us. The server returned, carrying a sheet cake on a flimsy plastic tray, little candles flickering as she walked. The room seemed to hush. People at nearby tables paused their conversations and turned to watch. She set the cake down in front of me. The frosting wobbled with the motion. For just a breath, I let myself believe it might be okay, maybe something generic, forgettable. Then I saw what was written above my name. The second I read it, the table erupted in laughter, loud, jarring, enough to drown out whatever old song the jukebox was playing. Sharon clutched her chest like she was touched by how funny it was. Dylan raised his phone even higher, making sure he caught every second. Gregory stared at me like he was waiting to see if I'd crack. Sitting there in that booth, cheap neon buzzing above, And that message staring back at me in frosting, something clicked. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being sensitive. This wasn't just a joke that went sideways. This was intentional, deliberate. A message they wanted me to absorb, paid for and delivered with candles and a smile. A few months before that night, I'd gone back to my parents' house one Saturday to do what they called a quick favor. My dad's back was acting up again, and he needed help clearing out the small room he used as his office. In his mind, I had time and 2 working arms, so obviously I was the one for the job. We walked down the hall together, past my old bedroom, and into a cramped space that felt like it had been holding its breath. The office was more of a storage cave than anything. Boxes lining the walls, loose papers spilling over a tired-looking filing cabinet. He pointed to a stack of boxes that needed to go out to the garage, then eased himself into a chair, trying to look like he wasn't in pain. I got to work, dragging box after box toward the door. Most of it was what I expected: old tax forms, faded receipts, warranty booklets, envelopes from banks I barely remembered. It felt like digging through the paper trail of a life that had just kept going. Nothing exciting, nothing unexpected. But then I got to a box in the back that was heavier than the others. Inside, everything was lined up in neat rows. Each folder was labeled in my dad's precise handwriting. One near the back caught my eye. Unlike the rest, this folder wasn't manila. It was cream-colored, a little worn around the edges. My name was written across the front in blue ink. And underneath it, in smaller letters, education. I just stood there for a second, holding it, heart picking up speed. Then I opened it. The first few pages were forms from an investment company. My grandfather, Donald, was listed as the one who opened the account. His signature was at the bottom of the first document, shaky and slow, exactly how I remembered it from old birthday cards. It was simple. Money set aside for my college expenses. The early statement showed regular deposits, small at first, then larger as time went on. Page by page, the balance grew. It was quiet, consistent, like someone had been trying to build a soft place for me to land, hoping I'd get to be someone with options. For a moment, I could almost picture it. That version of my life where I walked onto a college campus without a stomach full of dread over how to afford it. But halfway through the folder, something changed. The deposits stopped. In their place, I found withdrawal slips. Big ones. Money going out in uneven chunks, sometimes only weeks apart. And the names? They weren't my grandfather's anymore. My mom's name showed up on a few. My Uncle Keith's on others. Each slip had some vague note like family needs or temporary help. Words that could mean anything or nothing. By the last page, the money was almost gone. And the account had been closed. The date on that final statement landed just before the year I sat at the kitchen table, filling out financial aid forms, being told there was nothing saved. That we were all doing our best. That I'd have to figure it out on my own. Sitting cross-legged on the carpet with that folder spread open across my lap, all those old conversations started to shift. There had been money. It just never made it to me. My hands trembled a little, but my mind was sharp. I pulled out my phone and quietly took a photo of every page. One by one, until my camera roll held a complete copy of a story no one in my family had ever bothered to share with me. Then I put the papers back exactly how I found them, slid the folder into the box, closed the lid, and carried it all downstairs like nothing had happened. Driving home, my bag sat heavy on the passenger seat. Inside it, my phone held proof that my family hadn't just hurt my feelings. Long before a cake spelled it out in icing, they'd already cashed in my future. The days that followed my birthday were quiet on purpose. I turned off my phone as soon as I got home and let the stillness settle around me. I went to my temporary job, came back to my little apartment, made simple meals, and let each evening pass without the constant buzz of other people's reactions in my hand. It didn't feel like hiding. It felt like finally stepping out of a courtroom I'd been stuck in for years. In that silence, things inside me started to line up. I remembered all the times my mom brushed off my dreams as unrealistic. My dad looking down at the table whenever a joke cut too deep. Dylan repeating the same tired line about how I was always falling behind. None of that was new. What was new was the writing on the cake. That sentence tied it all together. Once I saw it spelled out like that, pretending it all came from a place of love wasn't an option anymore. On the second night, I turned my phone back on. The screen lit up with a flood of missed calls, voicemails, message previews. My mom's name came up over and over, followed by my dad, Uncle Keith, and Dylan. There were long message threads and even a few emails waiting. I didn't need to read every word to get the gist. My mom painted the dinner as some grand act of support I just misunderstood. She leaned hard on the idea that she'd sacrificed too much to deserve this kind of silence. My dad told me to talk to them before things went too far. Keith focused on my reaction like me walking out had been the real problem. And Dylan? He tried to play it off like a joke we'd all laugh about someday. I didn't reply to any of them directly. Instead, I sent one short message in the family group chat. I said I knew about the college fund Grandpa Donald had opened for me, that I had copies of all the paperwork, and that I wasn't going to deal with it over text. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple statement of fact. The secret sitting in that folder? It wasn't invisible anymore. After I hit send, the silence that followed felt heavier, but more solid. Like the ground had stopped shifting under me. The lights weren't on yet, but at least the floor wasn't moving. Not long after, I got a call from a name I almost never saw on my screen, my Aunt Elaine. She lived several states away and usually stayed just far enough on the edge of family events to be polite, but never pulled into the mess. Her call felt different. She said she'd talked to her daughter, my cousin Riley, who'd already heard about the birthday dinner, through the family grapevine, which never lets anything stay quiet for long. Only in that version of the story I was the problem. The dramatic one. The ungrateful one who stormed out over a harmless joke and started throwing around wild accusations about money I didn't understand. Somewhere in the retelling, the one sentence I whispered to Keith had turned into a full-blown rumor. I sat on my couch and told Elaine the real story. About the folder in my dad's office. The account labeled for my education. The steady trail of deposits that stopped. The withdrawals signed by my mom and uncle. The dates that lined up almost exactly with the years I was signing loan documents and wondering why I always felt one step behind. And saying it all out loud, finally turned a string of disconnected numbers into a timeline that made sense. Elaine listened the whole way through without cutting in once. When I finished, she admitted something that made my chest tighten. She remembered little things my grandfather had said years ago. Hints that made her believe something had been saved for me. But over time, she convinced herself she must have misunderstood, since my parents never mentioned a word about it. Now, hearing the details spelled out, she couldn't ignore the gap anymore. She asked me to send her everything I had. I opened my laptop, pulled up the email where I'd stored all the photos and documents, and attached every file to a message addressed to her. As I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, it hit me how long I'd been carrying all of this by myself. When the email finally left my outbox, the weight of what they'd done started to shift. It wasn't just a private burden sitting in my phone or my head anymore. Now it existed in someone else's hands, something that could, at least theoretically, be seen for what it really was. Elaine's reply came quickly. It was different from anything I'd gotten from the rest of my family. No guilt, no defensiveness. Just straightforward, practical words. She said what I found matched things my grandfather had once hinted at, and that this wasn't just a family misunderstanding. She knew someone who handled cases where money set aside for one person somehow ended up in someone else's hands. The lawyer's office was quiet and tidy, tucked above a coffee shop downtown. He didn't even glance at the papers at first. He just asked me to walk him through it. So I did. From the folder I found in my dad's office to the closed account. From my student loans to the years of scraping by that followed. Saying it out loud like that made my own life feel like a report. A timeline of what I never had. Once I finished, he read everything. Slowly, carefully. He checked names, dates, account numbers. He didn't say much at first. Just kept reading. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with hesitation. To him, that college fund wasn't a gift. It was a legal account with a stated purpose and a named beneficiary, me. And the money that was withdrawn? Those weren't slip-ups or emergencies. They were clear, deliberate transfers that never once paid for my school. Then, in calm, direct language, he said there were formal ways to demand that money back, plus whatever growth it would have earned over time. Hearing that was like being yanked in two directions at once. Part of me felt relief, like someone finally saw it for what it was. But another part of me cracked. Because now there was no maybe. No possible misunderstanding. Someone outside the family had looked at the same documents and called it what it was: misuse. And what broke me a little was knowing that my mother and Keith had seen my name on that account and drained it anyway. When he asked if I wanted to move forward, I didn't even hesitate. The answer was already lodged behind my ribs. I thought about the years I'd spent juggling rent, minimum loan payments, scraping by. About how my mother still talked about me like I was lazy or ungrateful. Walking away would have meant giving their comfort priority over my own future. Again, I told him yes. Whatever steps it took, I was ready. On paper, those steps looked simple. He filed formal requests for records from the investment company and the bank, so we weren't relying on my copies alone. He drafted a letter addressed to my mother and Uncle Keith, stating that their use of the college fund was being reviewed, and that documents clearly tied them to every withdrawal. He CC'd Elaine too. So at least one other adult in the family saw the truth written in legal language, not wrapped in emotion. The moment those letters were delivered, the family group chat lit up. The usual stream of random photos and bad jokes got drowned out by message after message. Long speeches about loyalty, about keeping things in the family. My mother said she felt attacked and claimed everything she did was for us. My dad tried to play peacemaker from the sidelines, sending short messages that just sank. No one really responded. Nothing shifted. Dylan chimed in with vague comments about drama and people going too far. Never used my name, but I knew exactly who he meant. And then, right in the middle of all that noise, my cousin Riley started asking questions. She wanted to know when the account was opened, who had access, and why, if the money was meant for me, no one had ever told me it even existed, while I sat there signing loan documents with no backup. She didn't attach any of the documents she'd seen, but every question Riley asked made it clear she knew there was more than my parents were admitting. No one answered her directly. They dodged, changed the subject, swung the focus back to my attitude instead of the money. Watching it all play out on my phone felt unreal, like pressing on a bruise that had always been there. For years, anytime I pushed back against how my family treated me, it turned into a lecture about how sensitive I was. Now someone else was pointing out the same cracks without apologizing for it. While the group chat kept spiraling, the lawyer emailed a short update. The official bank records matched the copies I'd found. We had enough to formally demand repayment. It didn't erase my debt, but it shifted the weight of the story. For once, I wasn't the only one carrying it. The next turning point didn't come through my phone. It showed up at my door. There was a slow, careful knock on a quiet night, the kind where the building already feels asleep and your mind is somewhere between exhausted and numb. I stood there with my hand hovering over the handle, already knowing whoever it was hadn't come to make this easier. Avoiding them had never changed what they did. It had only delayed the moment I had to face it. When I opened the door, my mother was standing in the hallway. Her coat was half-buttoned, her hair pulled back too tight, like she'd rushed out before she could talk herself into staying home. The overhead light made her look sharper somehow, less softened than she liked to be. For years, seeing her at my door would have felt like relief. That night, it felt like the past trying to force its way back in. I opened the door, but I didn't step aside. She walked into my apartment like it was a space she had the right to assess. Her eyes moved over the second-hand couch, the unsteady table, the pile of bills on the counter. None of it fit the picture she'd always held up as a successful adult life. I could feel her turning every object into proof that I still needed guidance, the kind she believed only she could provide. For once, I let that judgment land. I didn't rush to explain or soften it. She started talking in that polished voice she saved for doctors and school administrators. Calm, reasonable, controlled. She said she was worried about me, that she didn't understand how a birthday dinner had turned into silence and legal letters. She framed it all as a misunderstanding that had grown because my feelings were hurt. In her version, the cake barely existed. The words on it disappeared, replaced by vague talk about jokes that got out of hand. According to her, I'd taken things too personally and dragged outsiders into family business that should have stayed private. When she finally brought up the money, it sounded almost incidental. The college fund became something that had been sitting there during tough years, just another resource she and my Uncle Keith had leaned on to keep everyone afloat. The withdrawals were hard choices, the kind any parent would make. My name on the account, my plans for school, the loans I signed because I was told nothing existed. All of that drifted to the edges of her story. She wanted me to see sacrifice where I saw a promise quietly emptied. Sitting across from her, it felt like two realities were pressing against each other. One lived in black ink on official statements, contributions marked for my education, a balance drained long before I ever filled out a financial aid form. The other existed entirely in her words. A story where necessity excused everything, and gratitude was the only acceptable response. In the past, I would have tried to meet her somewhere in the middle, to smooth it over, to make it hurt less. This time I knew there was no middle. There was no apology hiding in her explanation. What I heard instead was fear, dressed up as concern. Fear of being judged by people who didn't share our last name. She never said she was afraid of court, but every word leaned in that direction. Fear of losing the stability that money had helped create. Fear that the version of herself she showed to the world might start to crack. She didn't want this to go public. She wanted me to pull back before a judge ever saw the documents I'd uncovered. She wanted this to stay buried in the quiet corners where family secrets usually live. When I told her I wasn't withdrawing anything, that I was following through with the process already in motion, the room fell into a strange stillness. I didn't yell. I didn't recite every moment she'd cut me down just to hold herself up taller. I just refused to step back into the role that made her feel more comfortable with her choices. The hurt in her eyes didn't come from guilt over what she'd done. It came from realizing guilt didn't work on me anymore. She left stiffly, like even the hallway might judge her as she walked out. After the door clicked shut, the apartment felt emptier, but it also felt more like it was truly mine. I moved around in small circles for a while, waiting for the next ripple to hit. It came as a call from my dad. His voice had that same worn-down quality it always did, like someone who spent his life avoiding conflict by pretending he wasn't in the room. He didn't argue about the fund or the withdrawals. He talked about the lawyers, the court, about what all of this was going to do to my mom and to Keith. Beneath every word was one quiet hope, that I'd decide it wasn't worth it. And that's when I understood. No one was confused about what happened. They just didn't want there to be consequences. If I'd agreed to keep it quiet, to work it out the way they wanted, it would have meant accepting that my future could be treated like extra cash. And once it was gone, it was gone. I told him I'd be following the advice of the one person in this situation whose job was to protect me. That was all I had to give. A few days later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. Thin, unassuming. Inside was a single piece of paper, a case number, a date, a time, and a courtroom in a building I'd never been inside. No mention of love. No guilt. No sentiment. It didn't care who sacrificed what or who thought they deserved to be forgiven. It just said when the people who had drained my future would be asked to explain it. Holding that paper, I felt fear slide in beside something quieter but stronger. A sense of rightness. For once, what they did wouldn't be measured by how much I could tolerate. It would be measured against something they couldn't rewrite. The day of the hearing arrived under heavy gray skies. The light outside was tired and flat, like even the weather felt the weight of it. I stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, repeating the case number in my head, reminding myself. I wasn't walking in there as a child asking for anything. I was showing up with proof. That didn't stop the tremble under my skin, but it kept my feet moving. Inside the courtroom, everything was stripped down to basics. Wooden benches, a raised platform for the judge, and 2 sets of tables for the people who were there to fight over what had already happened. My lawyer sat next to me, calm and methodical, flipping through a stack of neatly labeled documents. Across the aisle, my mother and Uncle Keith sat with their own attorneys. My dad was off to the side, hunched into his seat like he was hoping not to be noticed. Elaine slipped in behind me and took a seat. She didn't say a word, but her presence held steady in a room where emotions had no official place. The judge didn't care about the birthday dinner or what the cake said. None of the emotional wreckage mattered here. The only thing that counted was the language printed on account forms, the numbers on bank statements. And one by one, my lawyer began speaking in that language, laying out the story with the kind of clarity that couldn't be ignored. My lawyer laid it all out, page by page. The forms my grandfather had signed to open the fund, the clear designation naming me as the sole beneficiary, the steady line of contributions year after year. And then the sudden turn. The deposits stopped and the withdrawals began. Every document told the same story. The signatures at the bottom weren't mine. They belonged to my mother and my uncle. The money was funneled into their accounts, labeled with vague phrases that had nothing to do with college tuition or housing. None of it ever touched a university office in my name. The official records from the investment company matched the ones I'd photographed in my dad's office. There wasn't a single missing form or fine print clause that gave them permission to convert the fund into a family emergency stash. On paper, it was simple. Money that was meant for one thing had been spent on something else. Their side leaned into context. They talked about hard years, bills they hadn't expected, the pressure to keep the family afloat. They tried to frame the account as something they had to use, not something they chose to take from. They made it sound like any parent would have done the same. That love should outweigh whatever was typed on investment paperwork. But none of it changed the math. The judge listened without showing much, then returned again to the documents, to the actual wording, to the line items and signatures. What mattered in that courtroom wasn't how my mother felt about the sacrifices she made. It wasn't how Keith described his struggles. What mattered was that the money my grandfather saved for me had been drained without my knowledge. And no one, not once, had tried to replace it. The ruling came down calm and clinical. The judge calculated the account's value at the time it was closed, added the interest it should have earned, and set the final number. They were ordered to repay it on a schedule. And if they missed it, the court had the right to claim assets to collect what was owed. Hearing it spelled out like that didn't feel like victory. It felt heavy, final, quiet. This wasn't some windfall. It was a long overdue correction for something that should have been there from the beginning. The court didn't touch the years I spent paying off loans, or the interest I'd already handed over, or the emotional cost of realizing that the people who claimed to be my safety net had pulled it out from under me and walked away. Those were mine to carry, to sort through on my own. In the weeks that followed the ruling, the ripple effect hit the family. My mom's house, once the polished centerpiece of her control, started being whispered about in terms of appraisals and refinancing. Keith's name came up in conversations about bad credit and forced sales, not big plans and borrowed cash. Relatives who used to laugh along at their side comments and digs started pulling back, not because they suddenly saw me differently, but because the consequences had landed too close for comfort. My mom tried one last time to reach me, not at my door this time but through a letter. It came in a thick envelope, addressed in her careful, familiar handwriting. Inside, she'd written a version of the story where history, hardship, and motherhood all blurred together. One long justification. If there was an apology in there, it was buried so deep inside the self-defense that you couldn't find it. I read a few lines, felt that familiar tug, the instinct to make her feel okay again. And then I folded the pages and dropped the letter into the trash. Not out of anger, not as a final dramatic gesture, but because I finally understood. I didn't have to keep every story she tried to hand me. I didn't call. I didn't show up to help sort through what she might have to sell to make those payments. Cutting contact wasn't punishment. It was a boundary that should have been there long before a judge ever had to say her name out loud. My connection to Keith vanished just as quietly. No big fight. No dramatic scene in a parking lot or outside a hospital. Just a clear, steady choice to stop walking back into rooms where being family was the excuse for letting harm slide. Life didn't suddenly get easy after that. My loans didn't disappear. I still had to work hard job hunting, trying to find better pay, figuring out what my future was supposed to look like now that it wasn't built around winning their approval. I started therapy, dug into years of patterns, not because anyone told me to, but because I wanted to stop living like I was always one misstep away from being labeled the disappointment again. Slowly, piece by piece, the belief that I only mattered when I absorbed everyone else's damage started to loosen its grip. If there's anything useful in this story for someone watching, it's not that the legal system magically made everything right, or that standing up for yourself always ends with a clean win. Doesn't. The truth is messier than that. Yes, judges can issue rulings. Documents can assign blame. Bank statements can trace the money. But none of that can turn someone into the parent you needed them to be. What it can do with us did was draw a line that says, your future is not a backup plan for someone else's crisis, even if they share your last name. The real shift came when I stopped waiting for my family to finally see my value and started acting like it was already there. That meant letting go of the idea that love without respect was enough. That people who joke about your pain are just being playful. That staying silent somehow makes you loyal. It meant realizing that sometimes the only way to stop being drained is to walk away completely. I used to think protecting my family meant biting my tongue, forgiving quickly, and keeping things quiet. But now I know the only person I was really protecting by staying silent was the one who wrote "still a disappointment" on a cake and expected me to eat it with a smile.